Before there were people, before there was earth, there was nothing but darkness and silent energy waiting to be awakened. And then, in a moment no mind could imagine, everything exploded. The Big Bang, space and time were born together. There was no light, no sound, only the endless unfolding of something that had never existed before. From this primal chaos, the tiniest particles began to collide. Hydrogen fused into helium. Simple atoms floated through the young universe for hundreds of millions of years. Then they gathered, they collapsed, and the first stars were born. Inside their blazing cores, heavier elements were forged: carbon, oxygen, iron, gold. And when those stars died in violent supernova, they scattered their contents across space. Everything that would one day become planets, oceans, mountains, and us. You, me, and everyone who has ever lived, we were made from stardust. Your bones are calcium born in the hearts of ancient stars. The iron in your blood once drifted through the black of space. Even the water you drink carries the fingerprint of the earliest nuclear reactions in the universe. Then, in a distant corner of the Milky Way, a cloud of stardust swirled and collapsed into a small blue planet. Earth was formed. Rain fell onto hot rock. Oceans rose. And in those oceans, something unimaginable happened. Life began, not by magic, but by chemistry. Molecules bonded, divided, and created the first living cells. Then one day, a cell consumed another but didn't digest it. That ancient alliance became mitochondria, a strange partnership that gave rise to complex life. Millions of years passed. Fish swam in the sea. Some crawled onto land. They became reptiles, then birds, then mammals, then apes. Every generation carried the lessons of the one before, written in strands of DNA. And finally, somewhere in Africa, a primate stood upright, held a stone in its hand, and looked toward the rising sun. That was us. But before we talk of empires, pyramids, or war, before kings and alphabets, we must remember this. No human was born out of nothing. Each of us is the result of a journey billions of years long. A journey no one witnessed, but one that left evidence in your body, in your breath, in your heartbeat, in your mind that dares to ask, why? We were made from stars, but what makes us different is that we can tell the story of how. We were not the first. Long before cities or language, long before the first god was named, there were others, Homo erectus. They walked upright, they tamed fire, they made tools of stone and bone. They hunted in groups and watched the stars, but they were not us. Then came the Neanderthal, stronger, stockier, suited for the cold. They lived in Europe, they buried their dead, they made jewelry, they even painted caves. For thousands of years, they coexisted with a newer, slimmer, more fragile species, Homo sapiens. No one knows exactly what happened, but something changed, and only one species survived. Was it intelligence? Was it violence? Or was it imagination? Because somewhere between fire and frost, Homo sapiens began to believe. They painted antelopes on stone walls not just to copy, but to summon. They traced their handprints on cave ceilings as if to say, I was here. They sang to the moon. They whispered to the wind. They feared death and imagined what might come after. That was the moment consciousness was born. Homo sapiens didn't just survive. They began to wonder. They mourned their dead. They told stories by the fire. They remembered names. They invented meaning. They invented gods. In more than 90% of human history, we lived in small groups, 20 to 150 people. There were no kings, no walls, no money, but there was fire. There was sharing. There were songs passed down for generations. And there were those who could dream, who said they saw spirits in the sky and voices in the river. Then one day, someone planted a seed. They waited, it grew, and everything changed. No longer chasing prey, humans began to stay. They built huts, they grew grain, they domesticated animals. We became farmers, and with the harvest came problems. Who owns the grain? Who guards the storehouse? Who decides who eats first? Inequality began, but so did civilization. Humans had to count, they had to remember, they had to write, and so they did. Writing was born. Cities rose, rules were made, and rulers appeared. But none of it, the temples, the pyramids, the palaces, would have been possible without one thing: the ability to tell a story and to believe it together. We are not the strongest species, we are not the fastest, but we are the only one that can agree to follow a myth, the only one that can imagine a god, a law, a nation, and live as if it were real. That is what made us Homo sapiens, not just wise men, but creatures who could look at the stars and ask, why are we here? And then try to answer it. The first cities did not rise by accident. They were born from the silent rhythm of rivers. In the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, Mesopotamia, the soil was rich and the waters were wild. Here, ancient farmers learned to tame the floods. They dug canals, they built dikes. They turned chaos into cultivation. And from the mud, civilization emerged. People gathered not for war, but for grain. For the first time in history, humans stayed in one place, year after year. Surplus food meant not everyone had to farm. Some became potters. Some became scribes, some became priests, and some kings. The city of Uruk rose from the plain like a promise. It had walls, it had temples, it had markets buzzing with trade and life. And it had writing not for poetry but for taxes. The first writing was not meant to inspire, it was meant to count. To keep track of barley, sheep, and silver. Cuneiform was scratched into clay tablets with a reed. Thousands of them have survived, and they speak of a world shockingly complex, of debt, of contracts, of crime and punishment, of families, gods, and curses. It was in this world that another revolution took place, the wheel, not for transportation at first, but for pottery. A flat stone spun to shape clay faster. Then someone realized that if two wheels were connected by an axle, they could carry loads. The wheel changed everything. It moved armies, it moved goods, it moved empires, but with growth came fear. To protect crops and power, cities built armies. War was no longer a desperate struggle for survival. It became strategy. It became politics. It became glory. Religion, too, transformed. No longer just spirits in trees or rivers. Now gods had names, faces, temples made of stone. Priests interpreted signs from the heavens, and kings claimed to rule by divine will. The ziggurat towered over the flat land, a mountain made by man to reach the gods. It was not just architecture, it was ideology, a staircase between heaven and earth, between the mortal and the eternal. And so the human story took a new turn, no longer just a tale told by the fire. Now it was inscribed in clay, stored in temples, passed to generations who would never know the faces behind the first lines. But behind every tablet, every wall, every wheel, there was still the same question: why are we here? In the land where the Nile meets the desert, time flows like the river, steady, predictable, eternal. And it was here in the rhythm of flood and harvest that the Egyptians looked not only at life but beyond it. They did not fear death. They planned for it. To the ancient Egyptians, life was only the beginning. Death was not an end. It was a passage, a journey through darkness to a place called the Field of Reeds, a mirror world of the one they left behind, only perfect. There, the river always flowed. The harvest never failed, and the sun never set, but only the worthy could enter. To prepare, they built tombs. They filled them with food, tools, and spells. They wrapped the dead in linen and recited prayers. They weighed the heart of the deceased against the feather of truth. Too heavy, and the soul was devoured by a beast called Ammon. But if the heart was light, the soul passed on eternal and free. This belief built pyramids, not for the living, but for the dead. Massive mountains of stone stacked with human hands under the desert sun. Inside, chambers carved with stars and myths. Walls painted with the story of Ra's nightly voyage through the underworld. A map for the soul to follow. The pharaoh was not just a man, he was a god in flesh. When he died, the people wept not just for a ruler, but for the balance of the universe. The rituals began. Embalmers worked with precision. Priests whispered ancient names. Gold was laid on the body, and the tomb was sealed, a world within a world. But even beyond the kings, ordinary people also prepared for death. Poorer graves had fewer offerings, but the same dreams. A peaceful journey, a place in the afterlife, a name that would be spoken forever. Because in Egypt, to die was not to disappear. To die was to be remembered. And as long as your name was spoken, your soul lived on. The obsession with eternity shaped every building, every ritual, every myth. Even time itself was measured in reigns of pharaohs who had long become dust. But their legacy remained, carved into limestone, written on papyrus, and whispered by the winds of the desert. Thousands of years later, we still look at the pyramids and ask, how did they build them? Why did they care so much about what came after? And are we too just builders of our own tombs? Because maybe the Egyptians were not obsessed with death. Maybe they were the first to take life seriously, serious enough to believe that what comes after is worth preparing for. In the fertile plains between the Indus and the Ganges, a different vision of existence was born. One that did not fear death and did not see life as a beginning, but as a cycle, endless, eternal, and inescapable. Here, in the heat of sacred rivers and the silence of forest caves, ancient sages closed their eyes and looked inward. They listened to the breath, to the heartbeat, to the quiet voice beneath thought, and what they discovered changed the course of human understanding. They called it Atman, the self beyond the self. Not the body, not the name, but the soul, the essence that travels from life to life untouched by time. This Atman, they believed, is not separate from the divine. It is Brahman, the eternal source, the unchanging truth, the silent presence behind all things. To realize this truth is not knowledge, it is liberation. To awaken is to be free. But freedom does not come easily. For most, life is caught in samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. Each action, each thought carries weight. This is karma, the echo of choice. What we do shapes what we become, not in punishment, but in learning. A man born rich may become poor. A warrior may return as a servant. A cruel king may return as a child with no voice. Life is a mirror, and until the soul sees clearly, it returns again and again. This idea gave rise to stories, to gods with many faces, to epics sung by firelight of battles, of devotion, of duty. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, not just tales but guides. The body was seen as temporary, even the gods took birth and died. What mattered was the journey of the soul, not where you were born, but what you did with the chance. And so people meditated, they fasted, they renounced power, they questioned the self. And in time, new paths emerged. One path asked, what if the end of suffering is not through gods, but through understanding? His name was Siddhartha Gautama, born a prince. He left his palace in search of truth, and under a tree in deep silence he awakened. He became the Buddha, the enlightened one. He taught not of gods, but of suffering, of craving, of illusion, and of freedom, not in heaven, but here, now, by seeing things as they are. The message spread beyond India, to the mountains of Tibet, to the temples of Japan, to the forests of Southeast Asia. But its roots remained in the soil of India, in the questions whispered by firelight. Who am I? Why am I here? What comes after? India gave the world not just answers, but a new kind of question, not about how the world works, but why the soul keeps returning to it. And in that question lies something eternal. In the wide valleys between the Yellow River and the Yangtze, ancient China dreamed not of gods or empires, but of balance. Not conquest, but continuity. Not dominance, but harmony. Here the earth gave both flood and famine. Life was fragile, but society had to be strong. Order was sacred, hierarchy was natural, and to question your place was to invite chaos. The family came first, then the village, then the emperor. He was not a god. He was a man, but chosen by the heavens. This was the mandate of heaven, a silent, invisible contract. If a ruler governed justly, the heavens would bless the land, crops would grow, floods would recede, peace would endure. But if he grew corrupt, if he taxed too heavily, waged war recklessly, or ignored the cries of the people, nature would rebel. Famine, earthquake, invasion. And the people had a right, no, a duty to overthrow him. It was not rebellion, it was restoration, a return to cosmic balance. But how could humans live in harmony if their hearts were full of desire? This question haunted China for centuries, and from it emerged two of the world's greatest systems of thought, Confucianism and Taoism. Confucius taught that order begins in the self, that a good man respects his parents, obeys his ruler, serves his society, and leads through example. He believed in ritual, in discipline, in education, in the slow, steady shaping of character through right action. He saw the world as a family, and every role had its responsibility. When each person played their part with honor, society flourished. Harmony was not spontaneous, it was practiced. But Laozi, the quiet sage of the mountains, saw things differently. He spoke not of rules, but of Tao, the way, the force behind all things, unseen, unnamed. Like water it flows, soft yet unstoppable. To force it is to fail, to follow it is to live. He said, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. He warned against ambition, against pride, against trying to control the world. Where Confucius built a ladder, Laozi offered a stream. And between the two, structure and surrender, China found its rhythm. A civilization that rose and fell for thousands of years, but always returned to the center, to the family, to the emperor, to the heavens. They built the Great Wall not just to keep enemies out, but to define the boundary of the known world. They invented paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder. And yet their deepest wisdom was not written in weapons, but in poetry, in silence, in tea poured with two hands, in the echo of a flute on a winter night. China taught the world that strength can be stillness, that true power is not domination but balance, not to conquer the world, but to live in rhythm with it. In the sunlit hills of the Mediterranean, surrounded by sea and story, the Greeks asked a different kind of question. Not about gods, not about kings, but about themselves. Who am I? What is truth? How should a person live? They watched the stars. They measured the earth, but more than that, they turned their gaze inward. And something new was born, not just civilization, but individualism. Here, in the small city-states of Athens and Sparta, freedom was sacred. But it was a dangerous kind of freedom because it demanded responsibility. It demanded thought. It demanded choice. Athens built its world on democracy, the idea that every man should have a voice, not because he was rich, not because he was noble, but because he was human, fallible, but thinking. It wasn't perfect. Only men could vote. Only citizens had rights. Slavery was real. But the idea was planted that truth could be discovered not by decree but by debate, by dialogue, by logic. Philosophers emerged like prophets with no gods. Socrates walked the streets asking questions no one wanted to answer. What is justice? What is love? Why do you believe what you believe? He had no scrolls, no temples, only the courage to doubt. They gave him poison. Plato, his student, saw a world beyond the world, a realm of perfect forms, unchanging truths. He said this world is only a shadow, and that real wisdom is remembering what the soul once knew. Aristotle, in turn, brought philosophy back to earth. He categorized, he observed. He said that virtue is found in the balance between extremes, not too much, not too little, but just enough. While others built temples, the Greeks built ideas. The theater became a place not of escape but confrontation. Tragedy did not entertain, it revealed. It showed humans torn between fate and choice, between honor and desire, between gods and themselves. And in the gymnasium, the body was shaped like the mind, disciplined, striving, free. Even the gods of Greece were different. They were flawed, jealous, lustful, petty like us, because the Greeks did not want perfection. They wanted understanding. Their stories were not commandments, they were mirrors. And in those mirrors we still see ourselves. War came as it always does. Persia, Peloponnesus, the rise of Macedon, the empire of Alexander. But through it all the questions remained. Carried by books, by students, by memory. Greece taught us that to be human is to wonder, to doubt, to speak, to fail, to rise again. Not because a god commands it, but because the self demands it. In the ruins of Athens, beneath broken columns and fading statues, the voice still echoes. Know thyself. That is where all freedom begins. In the dust of a forgotten riverbank, two brothers fought. Romulus killed Remus, and from that act of blood a city was born. Rome. It began as a village, but it dreamed like a god, not of peace, but of order, not of heaven, but of dominion. While Greece asked questions, Rome gave answers. While Egypt looked beyond, Rome built the now. And unlike Mesopotamia's priests or India's sages, Rome believed that power was the will of the gods. But power to them wasn't chaos. It was structure, law, discipline. The Republic was their first great invention, a system where no man ruled alone. There were consuls, senates, checks, balance, and in theory the voice of the people. They called it res publica, the public thing, a government not of bloodline but of duty, civic virtue, shared sacrifice. The citizen was a soldier, a farmer, a builder, a ruler, and above all Roman. But no republic lasts forever. Greed crept in. Generals gained power. The Senate grew weak. And into that void stepped Julius Caesar. A man, a myth, a warning. He crossed the Rubicon. He declared himself dictator for life. And in doing so, he destroyed the Republic to save it. They stabbed him to death. But the Republic did not return. Instead came empire, Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, gods in human form. The Senate still existed, but in name only. Power wore a crown now, and with that crown came conquest. Rome stretched from Britain to Babylon, from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germania. They built roads that outlived kings, aqueducts that still run, cities with theaters, baths, and temples. They brought law where there was none, language where there was chaos, order even in brutality, but there was a cost, a shadow behind the glory. Slaves outnumbered citizens, gladiators bled for sport, provinces starved while Rome feasted, and beneath the marble statues and imperial pride something stirred, an idea, a whisper from the east, of a man who said love your enemy, who was executed by Rome, but whose name would outlive Caesar's. Rome crucified Christ, and within 3 centuries Rome worshipped him, because even empire cannot crush meaning, and the greatest power is not the sword but belief. Rome fell not with fire but with fatigue, corruption, division. The barbarians came, yes, but Rome had already hollowed from within, and yet in a way it never died. Its laws became Europe's, its language shaped the West, its vision of order, of roads, ranks, and reason still runs through modern veins. Rome taught us the price of power, that greatness can be built on cruelty, that order can become oppression, that even the eternal city can fall, but it also taught us to build, to organize, to govern not just with muscle but with mind. Rome asked not what is right, but what is effective. And sometimes that question builds empires, but it rarely builds peace. In the silence of the desert, beneath stars untouched by smoke or stone, a man sat alone. He was not a king, not a scholar, not a warrior. He was a merchant, a seeker, and then a voice, not from within but from beyond. Read, it said, and though he could not read, something was written on his soul. That man was Muhammad, and the voice was that of the angel Gabriel. Thus began the revelation that would shape a civilization. A message simple yet eternal. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. But Islam was more than belief. It was a return to purity, to justice, to unity. In a world of tribal feuds and endless vendettas, it brought brotherhood. In a land where the strong devoured the weak, it brought mercy. In a culture of many gods, it brought one. The Quran did not come all at once. It came in moments, in visions, in verses, and every word was memorized, recited, preserved. It was not just a book, it was a living voice, a rhythm of divine thought, unaltered, unfiltered. Islam spread not by sword alone, but by spirit, by trade, by poetry, by the elegance of its law and the clarity of its code. It spoke of orphans and honesty, of prayer and patience, of a day of judgment where every deed would be weighed. The early caliphs expanded the realm, from Mecca to Medina, from Damascus to Baghdad, from the sands of Arabia to the palaces of Spain. But wherever it went, it carried knowledge. In the golden age of Islam, the world's light shifted east. Scholars in Baghdad translated Aristotle and Plato. They invented algebra, mapped the stars, built hospitals and universities, preserved the wisdom of Greece while Europe forgot. Mosques rose with domes that caught the heavens. Minarets called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. And in the heart of every believer was the Shahada, the testimony. One God, one people, one purpose. But like all great powers, divisions came. Sunni and Shia, politics and prophecy, dynasties rose and fell, faith remained. Islam taught that the word is not just information, it is transformation. It echoes in the soul, it orders life, it orients time, it anchors the heart. It taught that submission is not weakness but strength, that to bow before the Creator is to stand free from all else. No king, no priest, no idol, only God. And in that surrender, a new world was born, one that still echoes across deserts, rivers, and cities today, where the call to prayer rises with the sun, and the name of God is written in breath itself. When Rome fell, it did not fall into silence. It fell into shadow, into broken roads, abandoned cities, fires that no longer lit the night. The empire was gone, but something remained, something small, something fragile, something whispered from catacombs and carried in secret by the poor, the cross. It began with death, with a carpenter nailed to wood, mocked by soldiers, abandoned by friends. He had no army, no throne, no scrolls, only love, and that love proved stronger than empire. In the centuries after, the church rose not in palaces but in ruins. Among plague and war, famine and fear, it offered not riches but meaning. As kingdoms crumbled and warlords fought for land, monks kept the flame alive. They copied scrolls by candlelight. They taught children to read. They planted vineyards and built stone chapels. And in a world that had forgotten how to dream, they remembered. They remembered that every soul had worth, that the hungry should be fed, that the sick should be touched, that mercy was not weakness but strength. Cathedrals rose where once stood pagan temples. Stained glass told stories to those who could not read, and bells rang out to mark the hours not for war but for prayer. The church became more than belief, it became structure. A kingdom of its own, with bishops and councils, with rituals and relics, with power. Sometimes it healed, sometimes it hurt, sometimes it stood against kings, and sometimes it crowned them. It preached peace and waged crusades. It saved lives and burned heretics. It protected the weak and silenced the curious. Because even in the light there is shadow, and no institution remains pure for long. But beneath all that, beneath the gold, the Latin, the incense, the original spark still burned. The whisper of a Galilean man who said, "Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the peacemakers. Forgive them. They know not what they do." That whisper would not die. It crossed mountains, crossed oceans, and in time it would shape continents. The church did not just preserve the past, it redefined the future. It taught the West that life had a direction, that time was not a circle but a line, that history was going somewhere, toward redemption, toward resurrection, toward a kingdom not made of stone but of spirit. Europe did not awaken all at once, it stirred slowly. From the ruins of Rome, from the silence of monasteries, from the faith of forgotten saints and the fear of returning darkness. The church was no longer just a guide. It was the heart of the continent. It crowned kings. It judged heretics. It ruled not with armies but with absolution. And yet Europe was not united. It was fractured, feudal, barons and lords, serfs and swords. Land was power, and blood paid the price. But through the shadows, something beautiful rose. Cathedrals, not built in years but in centuries, stone by stone, hand by trembling hand. They were sermons in glass and sky, arches that reached toward heaven, light that bled through stained windows like divine fire. Inside, the uneducated peasant saw the story of the world, creation, fall, redemption, and the final judgment. But outside, the world was cruel. Famines swept the fields. Plagues emptied the cities. War was constant, but the church offered something deeper than politics, a promise that suffering had meaning, that life was a test, and paradise waited on the other side. Then came the Crusades, a call from the Pope. God wills it. A mission to reclaim the Holy Land, but behind the sacred words were human hands, greedy, fearful, proud. The Crusaders marched in faith but killed in fury. Jerusalem burned. Christians killed Muslims, then killed Jews, then killed each other. The sword was heavy with contradiction. And yet the East changed the West. They brought back knowledge, mathematics, medicine, philosophy long buried. Europe tasted spices, silk, and scripture from lands it once called heathen, and the mind began to stir again. Monasteries became centers of learning. Universities were born. Scholars debated not just scripture but reason, and whispers of an older light returned. The light of Greece, of questioning, of human thought. But still fear ruled. Witches were hunted, books were banned, and the Inquisition grew because truth is dangerous, especially to those who claim to own it. Yet something was building, something slow, something inevitable, beneath the cathedrals, inside the classrooms, between the pages of ancient texts. A spark of curiosity, of defiance, of humanism. The church still held the crown, but it would soon be challenged. By science, by rebellion, by a man with a hammer and 95 theses. But that is another chapter. Europe in the Middle Ages was not just darkness. It was a battlefield of soul and sword, of heaven and earth, of light and shadow. And out of that struggle, the modern world would begin to take shape. It began not with thunder, but with rediscovery. A text, a statue, a scroll found in the dust of a forgotten library. Europe remembered what it had once forgotten, and the mind began to breathe again. The Renaissance was not just an era, it was a rebirth, a renaissance of reason, beauty, and boldness. The Middle Ages had spoken of God. Now man would speak of man. In Florence, art came alive. Michelangelo carved angels from stone. Da Vinci drew machines before they were possible. Raphael painted Madonnas that seemed to breathe. Beauty was no longer sinful, it was sacred. In the city squares, philosophers debated, not only about heaven but about nature, about logic, about the dignity of the human being, about man not as fallen but as potential. They did not reject God, but they recentered the world. From the divine throne to the thinking soul, from the priest's decree to the individual's mind, from submission to inquiry. This was the age of perspective, in painting, in politics, in perception. Suddenly, depth returned to vision and to thought. Gutenberg's press shattered the silence of ignorance. Books no longer belonged to kings and monks. They reached merchants, students, dreamers. Ideas spread like fire. Luther's theses, Copernicus' stars, Machiavelli's power, all bound in ink. It was dangerous, because knowledge is never neutral. It liberates, and it threatens. The Renaissance was not always peaceful. It unearthed new pride and new ambition. City-states clashed, patrons plotted, artists were exiled. But amidst the noise, something greater took root. The belief that man could understand the world, that nature had order, that truth could be tested. And that meaning was not just found, but created. Education was no longer about obedience. It became a quest for truth, for balance, for the harmony between reason and wonder. And slowly the veil began to lift. The earth was not the center of the cosmos. The heavens moved by laws, not whims, and the body, once shamed, became a subject of study. A marvel, a machine, a mystery worth exploring. This was the beginning of the modern mind, and with it came a new responsibility. Because to awaken is to choose, to know is to act, and to see is never to unsee. The Renaissance gave the world the mirror. Now it would have to decide what to do with its reflection. It started not with a sword, but with a hammer, and a sheet of paper nailed to a church door in Wittenberg. 95 theses, a protest, a spark. The man was Martin Luther, a monk, a scholar, a soul tormented by the weight of sin and the silence of heaven. He did not seek to destroy the church. He sought to save it. But truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced, and power, once questioned, does not let go easily. Luther's words were not confined to stone walls. They were printed, carried, read, believed, and suddenly faith belonged to the people, not just the priests. The Reformation broke the monopoly of salvation. No longer did forgiveness come with a price tag. No longer did Latin veil the word. Now the Bible spoke in German, in English, in tongues of the common man. The church had claimed to be the sole voice of God. Now other voices rose: Zwingli, Calvin, Knox, each interpreting scripture in new ways, each calling for reform and building walls of their own. Europe trembled, not just in belief but in blood. Wars of religion tore through kingdoms. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Cities burned, all in the name of truth. Because truth, when split, can become weapon, and faith, when fractured, can cut deep. But something irreversible had happened. The soul had stood up. The conscience had spoken. And never again would the church or the world be the same. The Reformation was not just about doctrine. It was about freedom, about the right to question, to doubt, to seek. And that right would echo through the ages, to scientists, to philosophers, to dreamers who dared to ask, what if the truth is bigger than the tradition? But with freedom came chaos. Without a central voice, there were many, too many, and unity shattered. The Protestant world became a mosaic, fragmented, restless, vibrant, alive. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church fought back. The Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits, the Council of Trent, it reformed and it fortified. Art, once serene, became dramatic. Churches exploded in gold and grandeur, as if to remind the world we still stand. And so Europe divided, north and south, faith and reason, tradition and transformation. But beneath the turmoil, something sacred endured, not in cathedrals, not in creeds, but in the fire of those who searched, not for power, but for God, not for certainty, but for meaning. The Reformation shattered the old world, but in its fragments, a new one began to form. The world had argued over heaven for 1,000 years. Now it turned its gaze toward earth, not to saints or prophets, but to reason. The Enlightenment did not descend like divine light. It rose from within, from thought, from doubt, from a single question: what if we can know for ourselves? The printing press had already spread belief. Now it spread inquiry, and with every page turned, the mind stretched wider. The thinkers of this age were not priests. They were philosophers, scientists, skeptics, men and women who believed the universe was not chaos but code, and reason was the key. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." Newton saw laws in the stars. Locke imagined liberty as natural. Voltaire mocked tyranny with wit sharper than any sword. Truth was no longer handed down. It was discovered through observation, through experiment, through relentless curiosity. The church had offered answers. The Enlightenment offered questions, and people began to choose. Kings once ruled by divine right, but now they faced a new idea: the social contract. Government should serve the people, not the other way around. In coffee houses and salons, revolutions were whispered, not of arms yet, but of thought, of law, of freedom. For the first time, the individual stood at the center, not as sinner, not as subject, but as citizen, capable of reason, worthy of rights. But with light came arrogance. Some believed reason alone could replace all else, that we no longer needed God, that emotion was weakness, that the universe was a machine, cold, precise, and indifferent. In seeking truth, some forgot wonder. In exalting the mind, some neglected the soul. And yet the Enlightenment changed everything. It laid the foundation for democracy, for science, for education. It questioned monarchy, challenged superstition, and whispered to humanity, "You are not children anymore." But ideas are like fire. They can illuminate or burn. And soon these ideas would ignite revolutions, not in lecture halls, but in streets, in prisons, in palaces. The age of kings was trembling because the age of choice had arrived. And while reason became the new religion for some, others still searched for something deeper, a spark that logic could not light, a voice that no telescope could find. Because even in an age of answers, the human heart still longed for mystery. It began with an idea that power belongs not to kings, but to the people, that freedom is not a gift, but a birthright. The American Revolution lit the first flame. A distant colony stood up to an empire, not for gold, not for conquest, but for a principle: no taxation without representation. Men gathered in dimly lit rooms. They signed a declaration with trembling hands. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Words more powerful than any cannon, and more dangerous than any army. The world watched and trembled. Then came France, hungry, angry, ready to explode. The poor rose against the palace. The guillotine became the symbol of justice, and blood became the currency of liberty. The French Revolution did not simply demand change, it demanded everything. Kings fell, priests hid. Even reason was turned into a goddess. The old world was ending, and no one knew what would replace it. From these revolutions came more. Haiti, the only successful slave revolt in history. The enslaved became sovereign, and a whisper echoed through every plantation: we are not property. Then came the Industrial Revolution, not of flags and speeches, but of machines, of coal, of steam, of cities rising like iron forests. It changed how humans lived, worked, ate, died. The rhythm of the sun was replaced by the ticking of clocks. Children worked in factories. Men lost their names and became numbers, and the sky grew dark with smoke. But from these factories came new power, not just economic but ideological. Workers began to speak, demand, organize. Words like socialism and class entered the bloodstream of history. The revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries cracked the foundations of every empire. They asked a question louder than any trumpet: who should rule? The answer was not simple. Democracy was born, but so were dictators. Constitutions were written, but wars were ignited. Because power, once released from the throne, does not disappear. It spreads, it mutates, it waits. And yet in this chaos, something irreversible took root. The belief that the future was not fixed, that ordinary people could write the next chapter, that history was not fate, it was choice. And that choice was now in the hands of millions. We began as stardust. We became memory. And now we are the storytellers of Earth. This is not the end of history. It is the next chapter. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next video.